my best to find the shortest and quickest line, and perhaps to kind of push my way in front of a slower moving person sometimes. And when I find my line dragging, I'm often tempted to jockey to a newer, faster one. I say often, but I don't always do this. Tempted, but I don't always go through with it. Nonetheless, this week's gospel kind of hit me between the eyes. It simply does not square with my attitudes and my sometimes behavior. The last will be first and the first will be last. I mean, when we're sitting down and casually considering things from outside the fray of life and talking about other people, we can nod in agreement about how reversals like this can balance out certain inequities in life. However, when we put it in a real-world scenario where we are the ones with all of the stress and the pressure of life, with newborn children and sleepless nights, we are the ones who got up early and made the shrewd choices to be at the front of the line, well, then we're not so fond of what seems like an arbitrary flipping of the script. When all of our hard-won efforts are reversed for what seems like not, we can get agitated, perhaps more than agitated. And yet, with so many of the parables in Matthew's gospel, this one provides us with a glimpse into the nature of our human condition and also the character of God's reign. But what does that glimpse show us? This parable has been interpreted in loads of different ways. For instance, does this parable highlight the generosity of the landowner who pays one-hour workers a full day's wage? Or rather, is it about the exploitation of the vulnerable workers by a union-busting vineyard owner who deliberately sets laborers against one another when he frustrates all-day workers' expectations for generous pay comparable to the generous wage they've witnessed one-hour workers receive? Or is the parable really about economic relations that emphasizes the obligation of the well-resourced to provide opportunities for work and access to resources for the needy for their survival? Or is it the defense of Jesus' acceptance of religious outsiders who've responded to his mission and message? Or is this a full statement of inclusion of the Gentiles, though they've arrived late in Israel's salvation story? This parable has been read in such different ways, in part because the diverse context of readers and the reading communities matter. So what are we to make of it today? We gathered here in Jamestown, New York on the 24th of September. Let's start with a few questions. Where do you see yourself in this story? Are you the first who've become last, or the last who've become first? Or maybe we're just in the middle, trying to keep a low profile and to avoid detection. Additionally, I want you to consider, where is God and God's reign in this story, the reign that we've been invited to live into? The pattern of this story reveals both repetition and meaningful variation. In the first part of the story, a vineyard owner ventures out to the marketplace 5 times throughout the day to hire workers. The first workers hired, at daybreak, agree to a wage of a denarius for 1 day's labor, sufficient to feed that person's family for 3 or 4 days. The 9 o'clock hires are assured that they will be paid a fair wage, though it's unspecified. The scenario repeats again at noon and 3 o'clock. Finally, just before work concludes for the day, the owner hires additional workers, and there's no mention of payment at all in this case. These details create suspense. We wonder how well and equitably the various groups of workers will be paid. As the day progresses, the later hired workers are described in English as standing idle. So I want to draw attention to the Greek behind this, because the phrasing would be better put if we translated it in English this way, and without judgment, that the workers were standing in the marketplace without work. No judgment to them. The parable highlights simply their need for employment and the vineyard's own commitment to provide work, not a moral lack of the day laborers. And then the second part of the story turns from recruitment of laborers to their payment at day's end. Deliberately and provocatively, the owner instructs his manager to pay the 1-hour workers first. And everyone's surprised when each receives a full day's wage. This is a generous vineyard owner indeed. Yet when all day workers step forward, they're paid their contracted wage, the same amount as the short day laborers. Equal pay for unequal work. Understandably, they feel cheated and register their complaint. In response, the vineyard owner reminds them that he has paid the agreed upon wage, explains that he's chosen to be generous to the short day workers, and dismisses the envious and no doubt weary whole day laborers out of hand. This is a strange parable, and it has a strange mix of things: contractual obligations for some, unexpected generosity for others. The owner's treatment of the hired workers is such that everyone gets the opportunity to work. Everyone receives enough to live, regardless of the quantity or quality of their work. Not how I'd run a business, that's for sure. That said, I think all of us would want to live in a world where everyone have enough to live on, where there's meaningful work and labor for everyone. But the new expectations that this story shares do not seem to correspond to the world in which I live, in which we live. So what are we supposed to make of this? If we equate God with the vineyard owner, then it is clear that our generous God desires to show us that there's enough work for all of us in the vineyard. And there's all the resources required to sustain life. But the parable takes a step backward and doesn't quite tell us how to embrace God's reign or to live into this new reality. That's what we want, is a tutorial. That's fine and good, God, but how do we do that? It does, however, give us a first step in upsetting our expectations and perhaps our contracted notions of fairness, equity, maybe equality. Like most of the parables, it invites us to suspend our judgment and just live, to see that life is abundant and it will provide if others don't limit it. I feel like I stumbled right into this parable just last month at our Monday night cafe. If you aren't aware, we have a special ministry on Monday nights where we buy local food, vegetables primarily, all New York State grown, and then we cook them together and we feed everybody who will come. It's kind of this great opportunity to create community and abundance out of what seems like nothing, and it's a great time. So the crowds were gathered, and they were hungry. Folks had come early and were sitting at their round tables waiting. As we were bringing out the food, we had invited folks to come up a table at a time. Of course, this meant that some would be first and others would be last. I was so busy offering up free food and tending to all the little details that it never occurred to me to imagine how some would object to those conditions. But of course, there was one gentleman who was particularly agitated at having to wait, just as I've already said I would have been. He'd been there early, and it felt like it wasn't fair that he was going to end up being served last. So he came up to make his frustrations known. I didn't care because I knew there was enough food, so I invited him to come up. And that could have been the recipe for a disaster right there. Luckily, however, everyone else there that night, as in the night before, the last time we did it, was filled with joy, and they generously allowed him to jump ahead of them in line. There was enough for everyone. But as I watched things unfold that night, I was struck by two things. First, the crowd that night was living into the generosity of God's reign in a way that I rarely do. They saw that this man needed a little extra grace and care and respect, and so they extended it to him. What did it cost them? Second, I saw how small and sad we make our lives when we insist on being first. I was saddened by this gentleman's lack of joy. Everyone else in the room was brimming and filled with abundance and joy and happiness. But this man, all he could see was what he lacked. As I watched the crowd, I saw Jesus' parable come to life in a new way. The crowd showed me the way that we limit God's reign by walking around life with misplaced expectations. They showed me that even when we set out to share, too often our generosity comes with expectations, with requirements hidden even to our own selves. It reminded me of a Zen Buddhist koan that I recently encountered. This is how the story goes. There was a Zen master whose teaching was so powerful, they had to send in the fire trucks. No, it's a different story. Whose teaching was so powerful that they attracted great crowds to his. Oh. Things are in hand, so we'll try and continue as best as we're able, but there will be a disruption again. Back to our Zen master, if we can get there. There was a Zen master who had this great ministry that was attracting crowds. And the temple that he lived in, worked from, was too small. And a wealthy merchant decided to donate 500 pieces of gold to construct a new, bigger space. The money he brought to the teacher, and the master consented. "All right," he said, "I'll take it." The merchant gave the master the sack of gold, but he was dissatisfied with the attitude of the teacher. One might live a whole year on a single piece of that gold, and the merchant had not even been thanked for 500 of them. And so he reiterated the point with a certain expectation in mind. "In that sack are 500 pieces of silver," he told. "Yes, so you said," replied the master. "Even if I am a wealthy merchant, 500 pieces of gold is still a lot of money," said the merchant. The master, sensing his expectation, asked, "Do you want me to thank you for it?" "Well, you ought to," replied the merchant. "Why should I?" inquired the master. "The giver should be thankful." The giver should be thankful. Perhaps that is what this parable is all about. It's not about the expectations that we have for others, but rather the joy, gratitude, and thankfulness that we choose to live with when we set the course for our lives. If we follow the example of the vineyard owner and our God, we can start from a place of abundant joy and thankfulness. If we start from that place, how can we not find it everywhere, even in moments like this, when we're thankful for every breath that we have? That's how we discover gratitude. The thankful giver is a thankful liver. What are you holding back this morning? What do you secretly expect that is getting in the way of your abundant life? Maybe it's our expectations that create very limitations that make some first and others last. It reminds me of that Lebanese American poet, Khalil Gibran, expressed in his book, The Prophet. He wrote, "You often say, 'I would give but only to the deserving.' The trees in your orchard say not so, nor the flocks in your pasture. They give that they may live, for to withhold is to perish. See first that you yourselves deserve to be a giver and an instrument of giving. For in truth it is life that gives unto life, while you who deem yourself a giver are but a witness. You give but little when you give of your possessions. It is when you give of yourself that you truly give. Today we are invited to live by a different set of expectations. Will you answer the call? Amen.